sing, till earth and heaven ring with the harmonies of liberty. Let our rejoicing rise high as the listening skies. Let it resound loud as the rolling sea. Sing a song full of the faith that the dark past has taught us. Sing a song full of the hope that the present has brought us. Praising the rising sun of our new day begun. Let us march on till victory is won. Stony the road we trod, bitter the chastening rod, felt in the days when hope unborn had died, yet with a steady beat and not a weary feet, come to the place for which our fathers died. We have come over away with the peace that's been watered. We have come treading our path through the blood of the slaughtered. Out from the gloomy past till now we stand at last, where the white beam of our bright star is cast. God of our weariness, God of our silent tears, thou who hast brought us thus far on the way, thou who hast by thy might led us into the light, keep us forever in the path we pray. Test our feet straight from the places our God where we met thee. Blessed our hearts drunk with the wine of the world before death be. Settled beneath thy hand, may we forever stand, true to our God, true to our native land.
The intersection between Father's Day and Juneteenth has been remarkably captured in this beautiful essay from the poet, playwright, and chancellor of the American Academy of Poets, Elizabeth Alexander. She's a Black woman, and I, with much gratitude, invite Leandra Salazar Slaughter to give voice to her words.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Good morning. Thank you. On Father's Day, this is an ode to Black male presence, to the fathers and uncles and brothers and friends who are active and present in our lives every single day. It is also an ode to two Black fathers in particular, my own Clifford Alexander and my late husband, Ficre Gabrius, who is the father of my two teenage sons. I write this ode against the backdrop of a language of absent Black fathers and endangered and absent Black men that becomes a drone, a buzz that overwrites some of the very stories and facts that foster spiritual, physical, and mental health in our communities. Do I want my sons only to hear a dirge that says they are ever on the verge of catastrophe, that their every step may be their last? No. You see, I teach and have taught these fine young men to be mighty, strong, and large. Yes, large in the face of hostility and stereotyping, even as I have taught them to be safe. I am a single Black mother of two Black sons because their father is one of the so-called absent ones. 3 years ago, he died completely unexpectedly while exercising on the treadmill 4 days after we celebrated his 50th birthday. He was a glorious man, an activist on behalf of the Eritrean liberation during their long war, a chief and restaurant owner, and a fine Yale-trained painter. He was brilliant and peaceful, humble and grand. His name actually means love, and no one embodied it better than he. He spoke 8 languages, could fix things and solve problems, literally never had a crossword for his sons, who he adored every single moment of their lives. They were 12 and 13 when we so suddenly lost him 3 years ago. Fikre's way was quiet strength. He was not a loud man, though his laugh was the most robust music I've ever heard. He had a contemplative artist's temperament and was keen, quiet observer, perhaps in the way an immigrant must observe in order to make his way in new places, as Fikre did in Sudan, then Italy, then Germany, then the United States, where he built his life after the Eritrean and its long war and reign of terror in the late 70s when he was a boy of 16. You see, my father was and is from the Frederick Douglass School of Black Progress. Power concedes nothing without demand. He is a classic race man from his Harlem childhood to today, a warrior on behalf of fair working conditions and life opportunities for all people. He's even a feminist. Yes, an 81-year-old black male feminist who raised me to be tough, strong, practical, sky's the limit black woman who shares resources and is proud and fierce about African American accomplishments and tradition of struggle. You see, I use the phrase free black men to describe my father, Fikre, and other different mighty ones like them. My father taught my brother and me and the countless others he has mentored to think outside of the proverbial box that limit us as black people. For if you accept any of the conventional paradigms about what it is to be black, always failing, inferior, somehow lacking, then we will never get anywhere. Rejecting paradigms that consistently proclaim your inferiority is how you begin to be free. And Fikre words and wisdom are in my children's ears as surely as if it were speaking to them today, telling our sons, never ever be smaller than you are. Be large. We are now extended family with my parents living in the same building where my father gives my sons wisdom, comfort, perspectives, and a little cash and hard candy slipped into their pockets old school style. My sons feel their father's touch, for his affection was bountiful, and he loved them with generous physical affection. Everyone needs physical affection, and perhaps more so young black men who society sometimes sees as unlovable, untouchable, to be avoided. The touch of their fathers and their grandfathers and their uncles and family friends are strong black hands that say, "We love you. You are cherished." They walk with the corporal memory. They walk with the straight spines as black men in their family walk with straight spines. They grow in that beauty and infinite possibility. Today is Father's Day, and this is for the black boys, beautiful and brilliant, trying to grow up wise and strong. And this is also for the fathers here on earth and black fathers in the realm of the ancestors who love them. And for each black man who will call a black boy who is not his son, and puts a hand on his shoulder as the boy walks forward into manhood. Thank you.
At this time, our children may depart to their classes and we will sing them out.
Go now in peace, may love guide all your ways. Beauty be the blessing of your nights and days, truth on your lips and kindness in your deeds, faith to follow where the human spirit leads.
I'd like to talk to you a little bit about Beloved Conversations, which just ended.
Sure, that's.
Is that good?
Yeah.
Okay. Which just ended a few weeks ago. I'd like to tell you 3 things: what I expected, what I found, and what I learned. I didn't know what to expect when I began Beloved Conversations workshop. I had been attending the Wednesday religious education classes for several months, and in these we read about and discussed writings by African Americans and histories of segregation and racism. I guess I assumed that the workshop would be similar, but that's not what it was at all. Instead, we were asked to become introspective. While we often wrote in journals, we were never asked to share with the group anything we didn't anything we didn't want to share. This was clearly meant to be a personal journey as we each examined our own histories and how we became the people we are today. In the story I had always written and told myself, I had faced more than my share of obstacles, and through sheer will and hard work, I overcame them and succeeded beyond my expectations. Through the workshop, I learned that that story was incomplete. What I hadn't considered was how my own and my family's position within the cultural institution of racism contributed to my experiences and my successes. I learned that though I had faced many obstacles, my path to overcoming them was smoothed by the color of my skin and in subtle and not so subtle ways as I unknowingly benefited from racism. I learned how much the personal experiences of my childhood and my experiences as a woman made me very angry when anyone was made to feel less than. I learned that good intentions are not always enough, especially when it comes to language, and that without cultural sensitivity, well-meaning people frequently stick their feet in their mouths. Finally, I learned that I have a lot to learn, and that if I ever reach the point where I think I fully understand the complexities of institutional racism, I probably don't.
Hi, I'm Chris. I first joined All Souls in 1990, and although I've been absent for a number of years, I've started to attend again. And to get back on the flow of things, I participated in the Beloved Conversations program. Social justice has always been, racial justice has always been very important to me. The first Beloved Conversations gathering was with a number of churches, All Souls, Smooch, Lawrence, Topeka, and Manhattan. And we all gathered in at Smooch, possibly 65, maybe 70 people. And the first thing I noticed looking around the room is there were only, say, 4 to 6 men there. One of them was me. And I was thinking maybe we should have called it Tough Talk instead of Beloved Conversations. When I heard of the Beloved Conversations program, I thought it might be just more of the same, the work that I've done before. It was tough at times, and the experience was deeper and different than what I had previously experienced. The last time I was active in racial justice, it was in the early 90s here at All Souls. And then we decided to go out and into the Black community, and we figured out what we should do. We talked to Sister Church, we talked to Alvin Brooks, the Mayor Pro Temp, and a number of organizations to see what, how we could be effective and what we should do. And in Beloved Conversations, I learned that a lot of white people do that. they go out into the community and ask them what we can do. That ends up being more work for them. And I learned that what we should really do is study it ourselves and learn about it before we go and ask them, so we can be better at it and not be an additional burden. In Beloved Conversations, I experienced a clear recognition to what people of color might face every day with the force of white supremacy and white privilege. What it might do to those people of color in their everyday life. Just understanding the effect of microaggressions have on their everyday life. Even those most microaggressions, all the way down to the very ugly language, it really gives them a hurt that lasts a long time. It's much to think about. The 8 sessions that I attended, we did a lot what Peggy said. She answered it in great detail and talked about it. But the last 2 sessions, we talked about, and with all the things we learned, about what we might do here at All Souls to get the process of renew the racial justice process. And I'm hopeful that we can do that. I'm hopeful we can renew it. And I'm hopeful that many of you will join Beloved Conversations. I think there'll be more programs. And it was really meaningful to me. I'm thankful for the valuable time I spent with my Beloved Conversation comrades, and the awe, and very thankful to Reagan and Anna, who were our facilitators and who spent an incredible amount of time, and they made our program very effective. This is not easy. This is tough stuff. And it's hard to figure out what the destination is. To try to make a difference and to fight for racial justice only seems human. It only seems human to fight for racial justice and equality. Thank you. I was just reminded I have to stay up here. So I invite you. This is the offertory for the Black Life UU organization. And many of you probably heard about them. There's going to be a number of programs that you could probably attend at the gathering next week. But they are integrating within our church. They're doing a lot. They're people that could really teach us a lot. And I noticed that because of the heat, probably we're a little lower in attendance, so you might have to dig a little deeper today. We can start.
The offering will now be given and gratefully received.
Crying, brother, there's far too many of you dying. You know we've got to find a way to bring some loving here today. Yeah. Father, other. We don't need to escalate. You see, war is not the answer, for only love can conquer hate. You know we've got to find a way to bring some loving here today. Hey, picket signs, picket lines, don't punish me with brutality. Talk to me so you can see what's going on. What's going on? What's going on? Tell me what's going on. Ooh. Yeah, 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 yeah. Mother, everybody thinks we're wrong. Oh, but who are they to judge us? Simply because I wear a big afro and your hair is long. So you know we've got to find a way to bring some understanding here today. Hey, picket lines, picket signs, don't punish me with brutality. Come on, talk to me so you can see what's going on. What's going on? Tell me what's going on. I'll tell you what's going on. Yeah, 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 yeah. Right on. Tell me what's going on. What's going on? What's going on? What's going on? I can't hear you. What's going on? What's going on? What's going on? A little bit louder. Tell me what's going on. What's going on? We want to know what's going on. What's going on? What's going on? Tell me what's going on. Right on, baby. Yeah.
Will you join me in the words of dedication for our offering? We dedicate our offerings and our actions to the mission at the heart of this congregation, to build a respectful, caring community, to inspire personal and spiritual growth, and to create change toward a just and compassionate society.
Good morning. Obviously, I'm not Angela Allard, last-minute substitution, but here is readings from the words of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Martin Luther King knew how difficult it would be, especially at the end of long struggle that had torn the country apart, to build a new kind of movement that would cut across all the divides of gender and race that keep oppressed peoples fighting each other instead of the common systems that oppress them. He called for a poor people's campaign that would disrupt the nation. In 1967, he told his staff, "We have moved from the era of civil rights to the era of human rights. an era where we are called upon to raise certain basic questions about the whole society. We have been in a reform movement, but after Selma and the Voting Rights Bill, we moved into a new era, which must be the era of revolution. We must recognize that we can't solve our problem now until there is a radical redistribution of economic and political power. This means a revolution of values and other things. We must see now that the evils of racism, economic exploitation, and militarism are all tied together. You can't really get rid of one without getting rid of the others. Later that year, while making a public call for a Poor People's Campaign, he said, "The emergency we now face is economic, and it is a desperate and worsening situation. For the 35 million poor people in America, not even to mention just yet the poor in other nations, there is a kind of strangulation in the air, and it is getting worse as the gap between the poor and the affluent society increases. The dispossessed of this nation, the poor, both white and Negro, live in a cruelly unjust society. They must organize a revolution against the injustice, not against the lives of the people who are their fellow citizens, but against the structures through which society is refusing to take means which have been called for and which are at hand to lift the load of poverty. There are millions of poor people in this country who have very little or even nothing to lose. If they can be helped to take action together, they will do so with a freedom and a power that will be a new and unsettling force in our complacent national life."
I hope you know the story by now. We didn't learn about it in history class when I was growing up. It would not have fit the dominant narrative that my generation of white public school students were supposed to be learning. In point of fact, this was part of our own childhood mythological vocabulary. Whenever we were told to do something we didn't want to do, especially by someone whose authority we felt was questionable, we would retort with maximum snark, "Lincoln freed the slaves, remember?" Whatever other vague data we might or might not retain from our history books, that at least was one incontrovertible fact. I wonder now, as it never occurred to me to do then, how that riposte rang in the ears of the children of color in my classes. I wonder if any of them at the time knew the story of Juneteenth. If so, it wasn't something they shared with the white kids. Being fresh out of school for the summer was excitement enough, and 4th of July coming soon, I don't think it would have gotten any traction in our version of the national narrative. But we know it now, I hope. We know that it took 2.5 years from the time the Emancipation Proclamation went into effect on the first day of 1863 until the enslaved people of Galveston, Texas, were publicly informed of their freedom by Union Army General Gordon Granger on June 19, 1865. The news spread across Texas after that, over the last days of June in various local communities, so that Juneteenth became the common reference for any anniversary date when groups of people who had been enslaved learned of their legal freedom. Early on, it became a day of celebration, of parades and picnics and speeches, and hey, notice this, church services. Probably without air conditioning, y'all. Above all, a day of remembering, of storytelling, of anamnesis, the act of deliberate not forgetting. In the end, the stories that it tells together are the one thing a community has for sure. Everything else can be taken away. But if the stories are remembered, the community still exists, still offers its members identity, meaning, hope. Stories matter. Stories tell us what the world is and who we are in it. Stories give us names and motivations and outcomes, patterns by which to understand ourselves and each other. Stories teach us how to live and how to be human, how to act and how to be good or smart or a hero. In fact, stories teach us what to want, what success means, what kinds of actions or people to admire, who to feel sorry for, what bad guys look like and act like. Stories have power. Every community, every nation, every advocacy group has its own stories. Unitarian Universalism has Michael Servetus burning at the stake for publishing his heretical ideas. It has King John Sigismund of Transylvania issuing the first edict of religious toleration in Western Europe. It has the ordination of Olympia Brown by the Universalists in 1863. It has Viola Liuzzo killed while helping civil rights protesters. It has Hillary and Julie Goodrich, the lesbian couple whose lawsuit brought marriage equality to Massachusetts. It also has Neville Chamberlain announcing peace in our time, don't forget. But stories can be cautionary as well as triumphant. Taken together, these stories serve to structure a narrative of heroic intellectual integrity, expanding human liberty, and sacrificial commitment to justice and equality. Even Chamberlain, though ultimately overtaken by the forces of history, was striving to use his diplomatic skill and moral persuasion to prevent the human suffering of another war. America, too, has stories about the Pilgrims starving through their first winter in Plymouth Colony for the sake of religious identity, about the noble founding fathers throwing off the tyranny of corrupt and crazy King George III, about the pioneers conquering the western frontier and Lincoln freeing the slaves, about innovative captains of industry and hardworking immigrants who created economic growth and saved the world from communism, about building the atom bomb and landing on the moon, about free speech and a free press and the right to remain silent and owning your own home. These stories, too, come together to frame an implicit, unconscious narrative that defines good guys and bad guys, virtues and vices, rights and responsibilities. There will always be stories. Stories are part of how we do human. The thing is, stories have consequences. They affect what we believe and who we believe. 50 years ago, the black preacher Martin Luther King told America a story that its white majority did not want to hear. It was the story of the black experience in America, and it was not about how Lincoln freed the slaves and everyone lived happily ever after. It was a story of daily grinding prejudice and poverty, a story of lynchings and night riders and burning crosses, a story of violence and humiliation on buses and at lunch counters and polling places, a story of drinking fountains and schools and hospitals forbidden, a story of hopes dashed and spirits crushed, and a long, slow simmering anger reaching the boiling point. Martin Luther King tried to show America how that story intersected with the larger national narrative that we have been taught to believe. He tried to show how bringing people of color into the expanding community of human dignity would make the American story even more coherent and even prouder legacy. Despite many people's best intentions and efforts, it didn't really work. America's narrative was inherently a story about white people. And white folks were always the protagonist and the hero. Their interests defined what was useful. Their preferences defined what was good. Whatever served to increase their power over nature and resources, over other nations, over knowledge and comfort and profit, was both inevitable and right. If we went to war, it was because we were threatened and other nations had made it impossible not to. If we prepared for war, it was to protect the prosperity and ways of life primarily enjoyed by white people. As Martin Luther King's organization grew increasingly sophisticated, he began to lift up the interlocking connections between racism, poverty, and militarism. Just before he was killed, King started asking the kinds of questions that continue to nudge at the edge of our national conscience 50 years later. What if the center of the American story has never actually been about liberty and justice for all? What if the unifying narrative is and always has been domination of the land, of the native people, of women, of people of color, of non-believers, of queer people, in fact, of everyone who isn't a cisgender, able-bodied, heterosexual, American-born, white, Anglo-Saxon Protestant male? I don't know about you, but I grew up under the impression that the American narrative was a great story. It just wasn't quite inclusive enough. It seemed as though some people were confused about the meaning of the word all. There was some work to be done getting them on board so that liberty and justice and human dignity could be stretched wide enough to cover the actual extent of human diversity. This was serious and challenging and even sacrificial work. But its ultimate success was a foregone conclusion because that was the American story, and we were all a part of it. Yes, we had had a few unfortunate lapses in the past, like stealing the land and violating the treaties with the indigenous tribes, like that whole slavery thing, like interning the Japanese and arresting people for homosexual activity, but all that was over with, and we should all get over it and move on so that we could continue to make the world safe for democracy. Martin Luther King started to ask, what does that story about America make us not see? What and who does it leave out? How does it help some of us to feel better about ourselves at other people's expense? He came to think that there was another story to be told. In a posting on its website entitled "A Moral Agenda Based on Fundamental Rights," the new Poor People's Campaign, initiated by Reverend William Barber, says this: today, 50 years after Reverend Dr. King and the 1968 Poor People's Campaign declared that silence was betrayal, we are coming together to break the silence and tell the truth about the interlocking evils of systemic racism, poverty, ecological devastation, the war economy, and our distorted moral narrative. The truth is that systemic racism allows us to deny the humanity of others. By denying the humanity of others, we are given permission to exploit or exclude people economically. By exploiting and excluding people economically, we are emboldened to abuse our military powers and through violence and war control resources. This quest for the control of resources leads to the potential destruction of our entire ecosystem and everything living in it. And the current moral narrative of our nation both justifies this cycle and distracts us from it. We declare that if silence was betrayal in 1968, revival is necessary today. We come to remind our nation what truths we hold to be self-evident and what values we hold dear. We draw on the histories of resistance that echo their truth down through the centuries and the power of the blood that has been shed through generations of struggle. We loudly proclaim that we will move forward together, not one step back. Today begins week 6 of the new Poor People's Campaign, with a focus on confronting the distorted moral narrative in our nation. That story that tells everyone this is a special country run by special people, and we don't need to follow the same rules as everybody else in the world. The story that says clever, brave, hardworking people always get ahead financially, and if you don't, it's your own fault. The story that says, if my kids are okay, it's not my job to worry about anybody else's. The story that says some people are more human than others and need to protect themselves with violence because those other people are dangerous. The story that says, if you got away with it, that proves it was okay. And if you got caught, what should happen to you depends entirely on whether you are one of us or one of the others. The story that says, America was great when the voices that questioned the allocation of privilege were few and easily silenced. The story that says, God loves us best, and so we know what he wants us to do to everybody else on his behalf. These stories have taken the values that many of us want to celebrate about this nation and twisted them to justify the opposite of liberty and justice for all. The opposite of helping our neighbors and creating humane communities. The opposite of truth and honor and serving the common good. It is time to reclaim the story of America as something more and better than the exploits, and I use the word advisedly, of white men. Juneteenth might be a reasonable place to start. If our minds are the least bit viable, history can always teach us a new fact. But what we mostly do with new facts is to plug them into old narratives. 50 years ago, Martin Luther King died asking us to think about a new story. A story about the ways that violence, privilege, and prejudice combine into a toxic force that injures us all, that degrades the planet we live on, and debases our national integrity. New stories are tough. They are, as Dr. King put it, an unsettling force in our complacent national life. I'm going to suggest that we cannot afford a complacent national life at this point. If we, good liberal people that we are, continue hanging on to the story of America that we learned back in history class, with all its cultural arrogance and moral evasions and silencing of voices of protest, we will end up as nothing more than irrelevant flotsam in the tragic tide of world events. I submit that our faith, this faith, calls us to be more than that. I submit that we are called to release our hold on complacency and learn a more compelling story about what our country has been and could yet become. It is an unsettling process for sure. Speaking as one who is still learning that new story, it's a bit like starting fourth grade all over again. But we are not actually starting from scratch. For one thing, there is still the vision, however imperfectly it may have been realized over the centuries. If we dig deep enough, the idea of a nation aspiring to liberty and equality can be reclaimed in the hopes of those who believed it even when it was denied to them. From the speeches of the suffragettes and the prayers of the immigrants and the songs of the freed slaves and the defiant banners of the pride parades and the union picket signs, it rises. Not just the hope of enjoying privilege for oneself, but the longing for real equality and honest justice. Look for it not in the halls of privilege, but in the hearts of the humble, who give the little they have today for the sake of a better future for us all. And we are not alone. We move among so great a cloud of witnesses, past and present, who testify and will not be silenced, who do the work of connection, who are warned by the powers and yet persist, who offer their diverse versions of the new story we must learn to tell if anything we cherish is to survive. Although it was not recorded or published until the early 20th century, Down by the Riverside originated as an African-American spiritual before the Civil War. It pictures a community renouncing war and violence in preparation for a new life across the river, following the escape to freedom, or the ritual of baptism, or crossing the River Jordan at death. To let go of the old habit of always being at war and get ready for a new and better story. We are not the first to face this unsettling force, apparently. Let's stand together and share the wisdom of this song.
Gonna lay down my sword and shield down by the riverside, down by the riverside, down by the riverside. Gonna lay down my sword and shield down by the riverside. Gonna study war no more. I ain't gonna study war no more. I ain't gonna study war no more. Ain't gonna study war no more. I ain't gonna study war no more. I ain't gonna study war no more. Ain't gonna study war no more. Gonna speak out a word of truth down by the riverside, down by the riverside, down by the riverside. Gonna speak out a word of truth down by the riverside. Gonna study war no more. I ain't gonna study war no more. I ain't gonna study war no more. Ain't gonna study war no more. Ain't gonna study war no more. I ain't gonna study war no more. Ain't gonna study war no more. Justice is what I'm gonna do down by the riverside, down by the riverside, down by the riverside. Justice is what I'm gonna do down by the riverside. Gonna study war no more. I ain't gonna study war no more. I ain't gonna study war no more. Ain't gonna study war no more. I ain't gonna study war no more. I ain't gonna study war no more. Ain't gonna study war no more.
We extinguish this flame, but not the light of truth, the warmth of community, or the fires of commitment. For all these we carry in our minds and hearts until we are together again. It is provided in the essence of things that from the fruition of success, no matter what, shall come forth something to make yet greater struggle necessary. Therefore go your ways, knowing not the answers to all things, yet seeking always the answer to one more thing than you know now. And may the blessing of truth be upon us, the power of love direct and sustain us, and may the peace of this community preserve our going out and our coming in from this time forth until we meet again.
Peace be with you till we meet again. Till we meet, till we meet, till we meet in friendship sweet. Till we meet, till we meet. Peace be with you till we meet again.